Okay, let's talk about how a simple tax, on paper of all things, managed to kickstart a revolution. We're going to dive into one of the biggest moments that set the stage for American independence.
It's a huge question, right? Well, back in 1765, the American colonists found themselves facing that exact problem. And believe me, their answer changed everything.
All right, so first things first, let's get some context. To really get why this tax even existed, you have to know what was going on with Britain. And the short answer is, they were completely broke.
See, Britain had just finished fighting this massive, expensive conflict called the 7 Years' War. It was a global war, really. And now they had a mountain of debt. Since a big chunk of that war was fought to protect the American colonies, the British government figured, hey, it's only fair that the colonies chip in to pay for their own defense. Makes sense on paper, right?
So Parliament needed cash, and they came up with what they thought was a pretty brilliant idea, a brand new tax. One that, in theory, almost nobody could escape.
Now, this was different. This wasn't a tax on stuff coming in on ships from other countries. No, this was a direct tax on the colonists themselves, on things they used every single day. And to prove you paid it, you had to have this special official stamp embossed on your paper goods.
And when I say paper goods, I mean pretty much everything. We're talking legal documents, newspapers, licenses, documents for ships, heck, even a deck of playing cards. It was a tax designed to be impossible to dodge.
So how did the colonists react? Well, it was immediate, and it was furious. Britain thought it was fixing a budget issue. What they actually did was light a fuse on a much, much bigger problem. And out of all that anger came this one powerful phrase that became the rallying cry for everyone protesting. It summed up their entire argument perfectly.
See, here's the deal. The colonists didn't have a single person representing them in the British Parliament, the government making the laws. So their argument was really straightforward. If we don't get a say in how you make the laws, then you have no right to tax us. They argue that only their own local governments, the ones they actually elected, had the right to do that.
But here's the thing. The colonists didn't just stand around being angry. Oh no, they got organized. They started taking action, using some really powerful and, honestly, pretty creative methods to fight back.
This wasn't just a few random protests. A secret group called the Sons of Liberty popped up in places like Boston, and with leaders like Samuel Adams, they had a single, clear mission: make it absolutely impossible for the British to enforce the Stamp Act.
At first, it was public protests, to show how mad everyone was. But things escalated fast. They started going after the tax collectors directly, intimidating them. They'd even burned these lifelike dummies, they're called effigies, of tax officials right in the middle of the street. The message couldn't have been clearer. And you know what? It worked. A lot of the tax collectors were so scared, they just quit.
So you can see the colonists were fighting back on two fronts. You had the loud, public stuff happening in the streets, but you also had a quieter economic strategy. Merchants got together and organized boycotts, basically refusing to buy or sell any British goods. And that hit British businesses right where it hurts the most, their wallets.
But it wasn't all about protests and boycotts. Something really historic happened. For the very first time, leaders from 9 different colonies actually met up in New York. They wrote an official letter, a petition to King George. They were very careful to say, hey, we're still loyal to you, but they also made it clear that this tax was a violation of their fundamental rights. This was huge. It showed that these separate colonies could actually team up and speak with one voice.
So you've got all this pressure building up. Riots in the colonies, merchants in Britain losing money from the boycotts. It all led to a huge debate back in London. You could say the colonist plan was working perfectly.
And by March of 1766, Parliament caved. They repealed the Stamp Act. They got rid of it. When the news reached America, there were massive celebrations everywhere. It really felt like a total victory for the colonists. But there was a catch.
And this is where things get really interesting. Because on the exact same day they got rid of the Stamp Act, Parliament passed another law. It was like they were giving with one hand and sending a very different message with the other.
This new law, the Declaratory Act, was basically Parliament saying, all right, fine, you win this time. We'll take away this one tax, but don't get any ideas. We want to make it perfectly clear that we still have the total authority to make any laws for you we want, including taxes, in all cases whatsoever. In other words, don't you forget who's boss. So even as the colonists were celebrating, the real fight, the fight over who was actually in charge, wasn't solved at all. In fact, this whole crisis had pretty much changed the game completely. And that's the real legacy of the Stamp Act. It did a few crucial things. It forced the colonies to unite. It taught them exactly how to fight back, using protests and boycotts, and, most importantly, it left that huge question just hanging in the air. Who really has the right to rule?
You know, we can't forget the power of the press in all of this. Newspapers and pamphlets were absolutely crucial. Think about it, the printers were the ones being directly hit by this tax, so naturally, they became some of the biggest opponents, printing articles and essays that spread these ideas about liberty all the way from the north to the south.
So, the colonists won the battle over the Stamp Act. But that bigger question, who would win the war over who was truly in charge? Well, that would simmer for another decade. And the final explosive answer to that question was the American Revolution.